Yeah, so I'm very excited to share this virtual stage tonight with two prolific writers who will walk us through a timeless essay by Doreen Fernandez. Nastasha Ali is the host of the podcast Exploring Filipino Kitchens. Her blog, where she reviews books on Filipino food, is such a gem, and I highly recommend you check it out. Bettina Makalintal is a writer for Vice's Munchies, where she talks about food and culture. She recently wrote a beautiful tribute to Kim and Doreen's legacy, and I'm a big fan of her writing. So I'm going to turn over the stage to Nastasha and Bettina to discuss the essay for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have a hard stop so we can make sure that we have time for questions. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and I guess to kick things off, that's Nastasha and Bettina. It would be good if you can tell everyone a little bit about your background and then tell us the story of how you started writing about food. And then you can take the chat from here.
Sure, I can
That's
start there. Hey everyone, my name is Nastasha. I have been running the Exploring Filipino Kitchens podcast last 4 years now. So that kind of I've always considered to be my kind of stepping stone towards writing about food in lots of different ways. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. I'm Bettina Makalintal, and I'm a food writer at Vice. I mostly write about food and culture. I've been doing that sort of for the past 5 years or so now. My first piece that I ever wrote actually was about Filipino food. So it sort of has always been the through line sort of my career to this point. Yeah, I would say that my sort of entry point into Filipino food was through Doreen's work. So it's kind of nice to be able to bring all of that together in this conversation today. So I guess to sort of kick off the conversation, I know that like I'm a big fan of Doreen Fernandez's work, and as is Nastasha and also Raf. But for sort of people who might not have read her work or who don't know who she is, I'd love if you could sort of give us a little background, Nastasha, so that everyone can sort of understand why she is someone that we, still care about so much today.
Yeah, for sure. So this essay was the first Doreen Fernandez work that I had ever read, like ever. And I remember reading it here in Toronto. Like I just was Googling something and I was like, why have I never like heard about this writer? Like I've never like read about any of her work. And that really was the spiral into wanting to learn more about Doreen. And so I have a few kind of, I guess, highlights of her career that I've gleaned from some books. Doreen spent her childhood in Silay in Negros, and she studied in Manila. That's really where she became a professor at the Ateneo and really kind of started off her academic career in that way. She wrote extensively about theater and literary culture, actually, like alongside a lot of her writings on food. And the key there, I think, is that when her husband, Ed Alegre, was offered a weekly column in a newspaper to write about food, he invited Doreen with him, and it was really the two of them who really started one of the first like big restaurant review like columns in the Philippines, and this was back in the late 70s and 80s. And so through all of that, like Doreen traveled around the country and they wrote about it, and she became like a lecturer. And because of her like dedication to like documenting like all of these regional like cuisines and ingredients that they came across while they were traveling, she made some really good friends in sort of international academic circles, like um, going to the Oxford Food Symposium. Like she has one of her essays in the annual books they have. So she's really like such a big figure, and she has done a lot of research. But my real question at the beginning was really that why don't very many people know about her, Filipino people included? And I think that's where like Bettina's essay too on Kim really resonated with me.
So the piece that I wrote, I think this came out in January, I think, was sort of about Doreen's most formative essay collection, which is called To Kim. And it's a collection of her works that she wrote over many years about various aspects of Filipino food. And sort of the point of that piece was to examine sort of how, this is such a formative work for food writing about Filipino food. And it's really put down this history that a lot of us have not read before. And for people who want to think about Filipino food critically and also Filipino culture critically, it's sort of like the go-to resource. But historically, it has been pretty hard to find, especially because of the fact that it was printed only in Manila and like has never been exported on sort of a large scale. Yet there are sort of these like fan groups around, around the United States and around Canada who have, come together around Doreen and have still tried to find her work in thrift stores and eBay, even if it means paying like hundreds of dollars for it. And I think that has sort of spurred this like community of people who is trying to sort of push the scholarly work of what Filipino food, the ways people are thinking about it. For me, I was actually going through my Instagram like from 6 years ago today, and I found that I'd posted a picture of to Kim sick like it says 366 weeks ago. And it was like, can't wait to read this, my first book about Filipino food writing. So I think that's like really a good example is sort of, for me, I never saw anything that looked at Filipino food in that way until I read that. And suddenly it was so much like history and context and, so much love was being given to Filipino food.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
So yeah, I mean, I guess we can sort of talk about why we chose this essay and sort of why this is a good jumping off point to sort of talk about Doreen's work, but also think about Filipino food in this sort of way. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Nastasha, on sort of why this essay resonates for you.
I mean, like, I'm a fan of Doreen's like writing period. Like the way she writes is very poetic. Like I really hope that most, if not everyone in this group tonight has read the essay, because that's really that's the way you're going to get a sense of how she does her storytelling. And I remember that, the things that really have stood out to me through reading her work is the attention to detail that she gives to her environment, to her surroundings, because yes, there are like essays and other books written about Filipino food and cuisine, but it's her combination of kind of like um, her personal thoughts on things, like how she picks up on the way that the people who are cooking the food like act, and it's just very anthropological in its approach, in that you are looking at not just the food and the ingredients and how it got there, because she was also one of the few people who, like I have read at least, kind of questions like where does our food really come from angle. But yeah, like for me, this essay was really just the best like introduction to her point of view, to her writing style, and like personally too, like asking anybody what makes up Filipino cuisine is always going to be a lively topic because everybody has opinions, and I think that's one of the reasons why like we're having this conversation today, is because everybody wants to hear what other people's not just opinions are, because like I think this is like us gathering is like a reflection of how much so many of us are like just curious about what does make up Philippine cuisine today. Like it's in flux, obviously. So
Yeah, I think one thing I find really good about this essay in particular too, and hopefully everyone got a chance to like read it or at least skim it, is that it like it looks and it, at first glance like it's going to be very academic, and the first section is like methodology, and there's a feeling that maybe it'll be a little bit dense or it's not going to be accessible. But actually, like as she goes into each section about ingredients and cooking techniques and names, everything's actually written in a way that's so accessible and like it's very clear. And like I think this is a big point of why this type of work was important, was because it explained these things not from this like dense like academic perspective, but just in a like very like everyday way that everyone could sort of understand. And so that way you can sort of break out all of these points about like history and politics and like cultural practices that have changed over time, but it's like in language that makes it very sort of interesting to sort of anyone who could read it.
Yeah, that's where the storytelling aspect of it like really like kicks in, because she is a born storyteller, and you can see that too. I think that comes from like her experience too with like being a theater critic. Like she just knows like the flow of like a good story, so she could like include it in her writing. Actually, going from there, so the next question that I want to bring up, and one that we ask on social media, is really about one of the key words on this essay, which is indigenization. So the question I want to bring up next is to ask, like, what is indigenization, and why should I bother knowing about it? Why should we all bother knowing about it? And I guess, like, for me, I like to think of it as kind of like a process, right? So it's a measure of time. And it's the process that like describes how something, like in our case, like different kinds of food, um, how like these different foods become so entrenched in Philippine culture, like over time, that with successive generations, whatever used to be a foreign food kind of has already become a part of the cuisine. It becomes an essential part of the local cuisine. So I just find that idea of like the foreign essentially turning into the local over time, like it makes so much sense. And so, for example, I guess to give a food example of it, we can think about cattle beef, because cattle beef were not endemic to the Philippines. And so over many, many, many generations, like now it's so easy for us to think about like bulalo, for example, if you're from the Tagalog regions, it's a very Filipino food, machado, like all of these like dishes that we just assume or we accept as Filipino. Those actually were, originally, that's got like going way, way back. But yeah, the indigenization, and the one thing actually that I wanted to talk about too is there's this line in the essay where Doreen says, she says, not only are the results of immediate and gut level concern to every Filipino, the results of knowing what indigenized food means, rather. She says, because it's the process in which not only a few, but the greater majority of Filipinos participated. And yeah, I just like thinking of that in that way, because like for me even, I would think like, well, what does this have to do with me? Like I'm like living in Toronto, I'm so far away from the Philippines, but the actions that I do to like me taking Canadian ingredients and turning them into Filipino food here is a form of indigenization. Obviously, a much smaller part of it than what happened in the Philippines.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the way that I like to look at the concept of indigenization is sort of like, it's about like adaptation, and sort of the way that Filipino cuisine is like inherently built upon so much adaptation. And I feel like that's something that's sort of never ending. That's always like, I think all of our food, like, even we think we sort of can tend to have this idea, I think, that Filipino food is one thing, because we are used to the things that we're familiar with, and, the things our parents made. But I think that ultimately, if you actually think about it, like our food is constantly adapting. And that's just sort of the foundation of all food cultures, but especially Filipino food culture. And I think that makes it really interesting to sort of to think about the ways that, like, Filipino food is Filipino immigrants in the US and Canada are making their own versions of things. And that's still, this is still sort of building off this history that Filipinos have always done with food, which is making things work for the circumstances that we've had around us and sort of adapting other influences. And I feel like that's so much of the beauty of our food. Like, I think it's like the example that one of the examples Doreen points out is just like adobo. Like, I think that's such a good example that, like, it's a Spanish word, and there's a Spanish version, and there's a version in Mexico, but like it's the national dish of the Philippines, and yet our version is like so distinct to our culture and our circumstances. And I feel like that just like really encapsulates the way that we can like borrow from these influences, but really make something completely our own. And so on that note, the next thing I'd love to talk about is sort of, so when she was studying indigenization, Doreen recorded like the names and the ingredients and the techniques of so many of the dishes that she ate. And so what do you see, Nastasha, as the importance of documenting that type of information? Like, why did she do that? And why is that useful for us now?
I love that this is a question that like for some people might be like, why are we even asking this? It's because we need to document the information. As you also, I remember we had also chatted about before, Bettina, but like it's so true. Like we have to document it. And like I think one of the, just to share from my perspective, from like talking with different authors in the Philippines through my podcast, one of the main challenges that we have is really just that there's not enough people collecting and documenting the information. Like Doreen's work is the seminal one that we are looking to, but there's not a whole lot else that I mean, I'm sure there are lots of initiatives on the ground, but the main challenge is just like presenting it and getting it to people and organizing it and stuff, right? So, like the importance of documenting it is because we need to, I think, but also like from, I guess, like a content perspective, um, one of the things I like about reading all of these articles and reading up about history is that I'm personally starting to like really understand the richness of the indigenous cultures of the Philippines, which is having for myself, like having grown up in Manila, like I can confidently say I didn't really care very much about it before, but like understanding that so much of like the everyday like actions that we have around like how we prepare food or how like our the dishes that our parents like choose to prepare for us at home, like all of that is from somewhere, and where is that somewhere coming from? So the diversity of the indigenous cultures, I think, is really something that is so ripe for like a lot more collaboration on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like a lot of the point of like recording this stuff is like, I feel like a lot of people can think that recording that stuff is done for other people, you know, like sometimes the record is like us explaining Filipino food to people in the United States. But I think so much of the importance of sort of like that historical record also is for our own
Us.
community. And to
Mhm.
think about the fact that, like, you know, especially as so many of us are like, you know, in the diaspora, it's really hard, it's really easy to sort of forget those like regional food cultures, because, you know, it's easier to think about like what's happening in Manila or what's happening in, you know, this like the metro areas. But so there, it's so important also to sort of record those smaller practices that aren't necessary, that are sort of getting diluted as people continue to sort of like move to cities, but also move to different countries. And I think it's really interesting to sort of see that growth of like interest in regional Filipino food as well right now.
Yeah, for sure. And for folks who are like in the chat today, if you haven't read Bettina's essay about the case for understanding regional cuisine, I highly recommend you guys do.
Thank
It's a
you.
really good one. Yeah, so I guess like kind of to jump off to on kind of a more historical note, one of the things that also jumped out to us while reading the essay was the examples of using pancit and paella, and like what can we really learn about our history and identity from those? Because I mean, they're very common Filipino foods, like pancit. Everybody knows that it's a Chinese influence. Paella, which is obviously Spanish, and like uh, the section of the essay where she talks about like the ground level versus kind of the special occasion meals that those dishes were cooked for. I'm actually really curious to think like how many people in the chat want to like discuss that in more depth. I hope we do later. But yeah, I just find that interesting because like the pancit and the Chinese dishes that were kind of brought with like the merchant classes, like even way before Spanish occupation because of maritime trade, like those foods had been like so already deeply entrenched in Philippine food culture that like, you know, versus like the Spanish ones that had that special occasion on. I I just find this stuff really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting thing about that idea too is sort of like the entry point, like the level at which the food is perceived when it enters, you know, the culture is very interesting to think about in the context of like Filipino food entering the United States, like broader mainstream. Because I feel like, you know, it is very clear that the dishes, the Filipino dishes that have taken off sort of in the United States tend to be, you know, party foods as opposed to things that people are necessarily eating every day. So I think it's so interesting to sort of read Doreen write that about, you know, these things that happened a really long time ago, and then to look at the way that process is sort of happening now, like in the way that we experience food today.
Yeah, for sure. Just that whole dichotomy, because there's always like levels, right? Like I feel like there's levels to Filipino food, and that's just another way like of looking at it.
So yeah, the next thing we should touch on that Doreen sort of goes into a lot in the piece is what makes up the native cuisine, and sort of how is it cooked and how is it connected to other cultures. Do you want to touch on this one a little, Nastasha?
I would love to. um, so let me just pull things back up here. I want to like quote a section where she talks about this, and this is under the native cuisine kind of subhead. So Doreen talks about, here belong the sour stewed, the steamed, the roasted, and the boiled. The ingredients for these are called from the seas, from the rivers, from rice fields, from domesticated animals, and from other edibles, and of course, from the leaves, bulbs, tendrils, seeds, and fruits of the evergreen landscape. And yeah, like just the writer in me is like, this is so like great to listen to and read. But that's what I mean by like the poetry in her writing. So she describes things in such a soulful way. And so that part talks about like the standard, I guess, cooking methods for native cuisine. So you have the sour stewed, which are the sinigangs, steamed foods, stuff that's roasted, stuff that's boiled. So very easy techniques and cooking preparations. And so I guess one of the best ways to kind of show this as an example, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I want to share some photos from a trip I did in the Philippines to Zambales before. And actually, this is the same place where the tree planting project, the reforestation with man travel is going to happen. So let me just share my screen here. Okay, so I hope everybody can see. If it's not, just let me know, Raf. Okay, so this is the valley in Zambales, which I had visited. And this is us trekking over to a community that we were going to go visit and have lunch in. This is on our way there. And so on our way to the village, we stopped and had some like taro chips, and there's some lemongrass tea that's in there, which was really nice because it was a really long hike. I think it was about 2.5 hours from the jump off point into the valley. And so after we had a little snack break, then we got to there's like a nursery where we were going to plant some seedlings. And the time that I went, we were planting, I believe this is kadyos or pigeon peas. And this is just a photo of my group we did the planting activity with. And then what was really interesting about this trip, so I did this trip with Mad Travel a few years ago, and it was part of a series called Life Stories, where it was mostly like other people from Manila, and it was just a weekend away to do this trek. But one of the reasons I went is because when like I was reading about this online, I knew that we were going to go around with like the local community and like pick some of the fruits and just like learn about like the plants and the leaves and all that that was there. And so these are just some of the fruits that we took, and some elders showing us how to like open up the fruit. And this is kind of the main event. So we had a beautiful lunch that was prepared by the elders of the Yangil community. So we had some salad here, we had some adobo, we had some fried fish. And the thing to remember too is that they're in the middle of this valley that like most people take like half a day to like get to really. So like these are foods that they were able to grow and produce around, and they're able to prepare for travelers who visited at the time. And so this is kind of like, I just want, when we were talking about native cuisine and the importance of Doreen's work, like the reason I want to show this photo is because like when I first started reading about Doreen like several years ago, I was like, wow, this is like, this stuff exists in the Philippines. Like why I want to go there and I want to experience that for myself and see what that native cuisine is like. So I wanted to share this to hopefully put this on everyone's travel lists one day. Once we're all able to travel back and do things. Yeah, so I really just wanted to share that and have everyone kind of see what the native, like experiencing the native cuisine can be like if you really seek out those kinds of experiences.
Nice. Well, now that we're hungry, so Nastasha, what food would you say sort of best represents Filipino culture for you? Is there like something in particular that stands out?
Sinigang for me, always and forever. Also because Doreen has this really nice essay about sinigang. It's a dikim. And yeah,
Yeah, I
sinigang
agree.
forever.
I feel like sinigang is my favorite in part because I think she wrote about it so well that it was kind of interesting to sort of read all of that explained. But it also just tastes the best to me. So, but I feel like that's probably also a good sort of jumping off point to think about, um, like instant sinigang mix, for example. So one of the ideas that Doreen brings up in this essay is the idea of sort of keeping the faith but borrowing the technology. I think instant sinigang is a really good example of that. What does that sort of idea mean to you, Nastasha?
I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this too. But like the whole like keeping the faith, borrowing the technology just makes so like much sense, right? I wrote in like my little notes for today that um, people keep the faith and borrow the technology because they let their appetite rule over everything, which I think is like one way that I would put it. Like your everybody's desire to have like sinigang or kare kare or caldereta on a weeknight, like that essentially is what drove manufacturers in the Philippines to even make those mixes in the first place. Um, and like, I guess just another way of looking at it too, like today, I like to keep the faith by ordering from like all these Filipino restaurants that are near me, but borrowing the technology of like Uber Eats and whatever app you use to order food online.
Nice. Yeah, there's so many options of restaurants to sort of try out now that way.
Mm.
I feel like for me, like I feel like to sort of the idea of like keeping the faith and borrowing the technology. I think if we think about it like literally in terms of sinigang mix, I think it's sort of that idea that you're not using the traditional processes to make the dish, but you are sort of getting that like essence of the experience, basically. Like, it tastes this like it gives you the same end result. And I think the way that I sort of like to use this idea, at least personally, is to sort of think about like the progress and the future of Filipino food, especially because, I'm in the United States and that's where I've grown up. And, a lot of the people who I follow and pay attention to are also Filipino people who grew up in the United States. And we're looking at Filipino food through a very particular lens, which is from the one that we grew up with. And so I like to think of the idea of like keeping the faith and borrowing the technology as sort of like, we can progress Filipino food and we can do new versions of things. And we're sort of keeping the same essence of dishes and the same sort of like the end goal of it is the same, which is that you eat it and you're like, well, this feels like home to me, right? But borrowing the technology, I'd like to think of in the sense of like, you're using adaptation and sort of different ways to make things and taking a new lens on things based on the different position in the world and things like that that you have. So I think it's just sort of a way of like extending that idea of like Filipinos have always adapted food and we're going to continue to do that, and that it's still Filipino as we continue to do that.
Yeah, agreed 100%. Yeah, I really like that point you made about like it's not bastardization, like it's just adapting, it's changing. I mean, that's if we haven't learned that from like reading Doreen's essay, like the whole idea of indigenization is that things are going to change. So that's just a part of life.
Right. And like I get why people sort of like, I understand why we all sort of feel this pull towards like one particular preparation. But at the same time, I think that we like do need to sort of be a little bit flexible about our approaches as well. I think it's really fun to see sort of the different ways, especially like on Instagram, where now you can sort of see
Yeah.
everyone doing everything all over the world. It's really fun to see sort of the different spins people are putting on Filipino food. A lot of people in Canada recently have been really exciting me with their stuff, especially in Toronto.
Desserts.
Right? So yeah, I think it's just sort of the ethos of Filipino food is this like flexibility and adaptation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bettina and Nastasha. That was amazing. There's so much to unpack, and I'd like to now open the room for questions. We actually have a couple in the chat. Um, so, guys, feel free to, even if you're part of the audience, feel free to jump in. I mean, the whole idea is for this to be an interactive chat. So, feel free to unmute yourselves and respond to any of the questions that we'll bring up. So first question comes from from Uluch. Are there famous candies that are indigenous to Philippine culture? Nastasha,
I
Bettina,
see that a
any?
few people have answered yema. That's maybe an option. Or yeah, the tamarind candies.
Bukayo, the processed bukayo, Raf, is a type of coconut where you have, those are strips of coconut that you cook with sugar.
Muscovado sugar.
Mhm.
Awesome. Um, Bettina and Nastasha, what are your thoughts on the adaptations on classic Filipino dishes by second and third generation Filipino restaurateurs in cities like London and New York? Could this be considered indigenization?
I mean, I feel like, I don't know, I feel like I feel like it's a little bit difficult because I feel like the way Doreen uses indigenization is to talk about, incorporating things into Filipino culture as a
Yeah.
whole. And I think it's sort of hard because Filipino food exists in the United States sort of amid so many different cultures. I think that we are sort of I think that second and third generation Filipino chefs in those cities are sort of establishing a distinct identity of like a distinct food culture, which, I would call like Filipino American food, for example. But I don't know that I would call that specifically indigenization just because the context is so different in terms of like, the breadth of cultures that we're existing in the United States.
Yeah, I agree with that point.
Cool. Yeah, any other questions from the audience?
Actually, I was really just wondering, can we get a quick like in the chat of like how many people like were able to like read the essay like fully? I'm just curious. Quick hands up. No, so I guess like one of the reasons I wanted to ask too is that like I don't know if this has come up for anyone, but when I try to like my immediate family and my relatives, they're not that like interested in this, but I think it's like super interesting. So I just wonder if like people in the chat, like, have you after you read this, like, did you feel like you needed to go to somebody and be like, hey, like, have you read this? Like, do you know about this like Philippine writer?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like one thing I think is really interesting about this essay and useful is sort of, there's a lot of people who are sort of resistant to the idea that food is like political or like cultural or means anything more than just being something that you eat every day. And I think that this is a really good entry point into sort of, introducing those ideas to people that like food is actually born out of all of these systems of like history and cultural mingling that have at many times not been by choice. So it really does, I think, very easily point out that idea that food is like the product of all of these political things and like historical movements and changes. And that's one thing I really like about it because it's easy to like, it's not that many words and it kind of gets the point across to people.
Yeah. I'm just keeping an eye on some of the questions in the chat here too. So there's one from Godiva. Thinking about Filipino food makes me think not only of what we eat, but how we eat it. So she's asking, did anyone else grow up in the US eating with their hands at home, only to realize that most non-Filipino American families don't do that? So I wonder if like I was really more a spoon and fork kind of girl. What about you, Bettina? Did you grow up like spoon and fork all the way?
Yeah, no, I was very spoon and fork. Like I'm actually kind of bad at eating food with my hands. Like my mom makes fun of me because I don't like, I'm like really messy and I'm, you're supposed to do it kind of neatly and like you can push everything into your mouth in like one clean bite. But no, I didn't do it enough to really like pick up the technique.
Yeah, for me, I usually eat with like spoon and fork, but there are just some dishes that you have to eat with your hands. So for example, I had like steamed crabs.
Oh yeah.
Was it 2 weekends ago? Like I can't imagine any other way of eating it except with my hands and eating it with salted egg and some tomatoes, and that's just like really the perfect combo. And it's really kind of personal, really, because back in the Philippines, like when my dad would want to have like a special Sunday lunch, it's always steamed crabs, steamed shrimps, steamed rice, and then yeah, the usual suspects like salted egg and tomatoes. But I don't know. I guess there's also that connection or like a personal connection that I have with how I eat the food. And I think that's, I don't know, it's beautiful. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about eating with our hands too is sort of how it is this like cultural practice that goes back so far in Filipino culture. And like, the Spanish tried to get us to eat with forks and with like utensils and try to get us to not eat with our hands. And sort of it's very nice to sort of see the revival, especially as like Kamayan dinners and events sort of pick up in places that aren't the Philippines, to see people sort of touch back onto that history and sort of make it something that is like being practiced again and introduced to new people.
Yeah, totally. We're gonna try to go through a few more questions here as we progress. We have one from Dominique, who says, "It's awesome to be in this space where I think most of us view adaptation as an integral part of the cuisine. However, in the broader diaspora, I still feel like there's a lot of gatekeeping or pushback, with many people uninterested or antagonistic to the idea of opening up the cuisine. How do we open people's minds to what Filipino food could be?" I'll take a quick stab at this question, and that's by doing more of this. Like, I'm such a big proponent of education, and like sharing resources is the best way to just, because if we don't talk about it and if we don't like educate ourselves first within the diaspora about the richness of the history and culture that surrounds the food, like that's where we're going to keep coming across those like gatekeepers and those like larger like forces, whatever they are or whatever we feel they are. So yeah, support people who are like doing the research and writing and stuff about it.
Yeah, I feel like for me, part of it too is sort of like, supporting all types of Filipino food businesses. So like,
Yep.
I think part of the problem is that sometimes I think in the diaspora, people get put off or upset by the idea that like other people's first introduction to Filipino food is this very like modernized version or this like adapted version. And I sort of understand that, because that is like an interpretation of the original dish. And I think that it's important for us to sort of still support and like make sure that we give the spotlight to those places that are doing things in sort of the more traditional way, so that there is an opportunity for people to try like what's like the old style that like aunties are making, but also like what's the version of that like the young 20 something person in New York is doing. I think that we sort of have to not give more attention to one over the other, but sort of support them both and understand that like all of that enriches people's understanding.
Actually, a related question is, yeah, like where do you find like resources on Filipino food? And are there other must-read? This is a question from Akina. Are there any other must-read writers beyond the Ream when starting to learn about Filipino food?
Would you like to go and share? What about for you, Bettina? Is there another writer in particular that you're like, wow, this person's amazing?
Well, so I think part of it is that like one, I think part of it is just supporting Filipino writers who don't always write about Filipino food. So like one person who stands out a lot is like Ligaya Mishan at the New York Times, who's Filipino and writes sort of about food in many different ways. And like Joseph Hernandez, who's in here right now, and Sarah Lynn Pablo are people who are sort of, people who think about food in a lot of different ways, that I think it's important to have that context too. But as far as like people talking about Filipino food, I think Angelo Comsty just wrote this book called Also Filipino, that's all about like regional Filipino cuisine. And I think that's a really important resource. I loved Alvin Kailan's cookbook that he did with Alexandra Cuerdo. And of course, like Nicole Ponseca's I Am Filipino cookbook. Also, obviously, like I always recommend like Amy Bessa is always a good person to sort of keep an eye on everything she's doing and try to like learn from her, because she's sort of passed down knowledge to so many people in like the Filipino food scene that like, you just kind of have to go to the source with that one. But yeah, I think I'm always trying to find new people on social media and stuff. What about you, Nastasha?
So if anyone's interested, well, to the people interested, on my website, it's just nastasha.ca. There's a section there called book reviews. And I am kind of crazy because I've been collecting a lot of books. I have over 105 books there right now that are like specifically about Philippine cuisine and Filipino food in some form. So just kind of like top three, I guess, would be Gilda Cordero Fernando. She's another, I guess I would consider her as well a contemporary of Doreen's. Also very difficult, unfortunately, to find her work. So good luck and hope you find someone in the Philippines who can scour some books for you. But yeah, there's a lot of information there.
Yeah, I'd like to add Feliz Prudente Santa Maria.
Yes.
She wrote this amazing book called The Governor General's Kitchen. And it's been like actually the source of a lot of these newer books on Filipino food. It's a very dense but very rich book. And actually, the great thing about social media and actually
She's on
in a way
there.
the pandemic is she's always on she's on Instagram. She does a lot of these like Facebook lives with different groups, and these are kind of like how do you say this, like monumentalized online, and they're always going to be there. So it's a free resource. For example, she did a very cool discussion on kare kare, the history of kare kare, with the Filipino food movement in Australia. And I thought, that video is available on their Facebook page, and it's just so rich. You should definitely like check it out. Feliz Prudente Santa Maria.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
And she's like, I just love that she's online on Instagram.
Well, and one thing I really like sort of about this current moment, and I think a lot of this definitely, we can't discount sort of how much work RAF does in this space too, because I
Yes.
feel like a lot of these books are very hard to access. Like I have a copy of the Governor General's Kitchen, but it's like, I'm so scared that something's going to go, like something's going to happen to it. But I think RAF's uses the Instagram as a platform to sort of take these original source information that can be really hard to find and sort of disseminate it to people. Obviously it's hard to share full books with people online, though I know people do that in DMs, because I've definitely gotten some about getting books sent to me.
Yeah.
But I think that people are trying to sort of, I don't think anyone in the community is really gatekeeping knowledge about the history of our food. And, I think people are trying to share what they can, and people who have access to books try to, pass on what knowledge we can in a copyright safe and friendly way. But yeah, I think that that's also sort of on all of us as we get more educated to sort of make those resources, to the extent that we can, available to other people also.
Yeah, actually, on a related note, I'm curious. Like, there's so many amazing books about Filipino food out there, but they're out of print. And I don't know. Like, I'm wondering, what's the most effective way to get them back on print? And this is, not just a question limited to Nastasha and Bettina, but to everybody. Like, do we write to the publishers and say hey, we want these books printed, print them. We'll pre-order 100 copies, and will they reprint it? I'm not sure. Really curious about that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because from my research for the Kim piece was that, even though there is such vocal interest in our niche circle, that is still such, in pragmatically, that's very niche in the broader context of publishing. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's really on, for example, Doreen's estate to make things more available, but I also I don't know. I feel like that's sort of a sad takeaway.
I have a whole, okay, so if tomorrow is the official episode drop for one of my new episodes, and it's about panaderia, which is again kind of for the people who are kind of really in love with that. It's an out of print book. It's very hard to find. And the only suggestion I'm making is, here is the book on the publisher's website. They have an email address there. Please go ahead and try to see, the more of us who email, maybe that's the only way. Trust me, I've emailed all the publishers in the Philippines who have published books already, just asking what's the possibility for this to happen, and never heard back. But again, we're a niche of a niche, so we just need to get past the niche of a niche.
I think one thing that gives me hope is that, for example, Tikim is available in like ebook form through college libraries in the United States now. So like one thing that sort of gives me hope is at least that like now that knowledge is more accessible to people who are like students and like younger people who can at least hopefully sort of like build on that as they sort of become academics and writers and just enter the world. So even if this original source material is not like immediately terribly available, I think that I'm glad at least that people will be like using it to build new ways of thinking.
Agreed. I'm just, I wanted to comment quickly on, I really love how excited and involved people are in the chat, so thank you. There's one message here from Liz, and she says, the way this essay discusses the difference between Spanish Chinese food in terms of colonization is so fascinating. Never realized that I unconsciously assigned prestige to paella and cocido, but arroscaldo and lugaw are everyday food. Liz, I thought the exact same way when I first read this, so thanks for sharing that. And like now that when you explain the historical aspect of it, I think that's what's most rewarding to me. Like when you take a second to like explain to like, if I explain to like an aunt of mine, for example, like did you ever stop to think about like that there is that social prestige attached to it? They'll be like, oh, not really. But now that we have had the chance and the opportunity to discuss it, that's nice. Yeah, I see that there's some folks as well about to people in Toronto. Hi. Yeah, there's I guess one quick thing that I wanted to get from folks is just like a quick like check-in. How is everybody doing wherever you are in the world? Like I feel like so when Raf and I first started kind of chatting about doing something like this, it was really more from like the idea that, you know, so many of us have been like reading and learning more about Philippine culture. Like I know for me, like even more than ever before. So I think the last year has really kind of kickstarted that. And I'm hoping that like this kind of momentum will kind of continue for the year to kind of get more people just interested in just questioning like what the stories are.
Yeah, I feel like one pleasant byproduct of sort of the life the pandemic has made us all have is the fact that like, you know, more people, a lot of people are sort of, as they cook more at home, I feel like I've been seeing people get in touch with sort of their cultural foods and, you know, the things their families made. So I feel like that is sort of like one little bright spot that has been happening recently, at least.
Yeah, any other questions from the audience? I'd love to have somebody unmute themselves and speak up. Don't be shy.
I'll go ahead. Is my mic working? Hello.
Hey, Paolo.
Oh, cool. Hi. So this is Paolo. I'm in San Diego. First, thank you so much for this event. I actually came across it off of Instagram. Someone shared on their story. So super cool, super excited to be here. I just have like a question, kind of a follow-up to that question earlier about, you know, second gen, third gen Phil-Ams kind of adapting Filipino food in their own ways and creating it and making it something just as it evolves, you know, with time, there's more technology, there's different palettes, there's like the availability of what's available in our areas. It's evolved into its own, I guess, like a sub culture of Filipino food. So I would love to know your ideas of at what point does adapting food and kind of, you know, progressing it forward become the gentrification of Filipino food, where it's, you know, co-opting Filipino food and making it something more palatable for like the colonizer, for someone who doesn't know what Filipino food is and kind of taking away from the essence of Filipino food.
Go ahead, Bettina.
Sorry. Or did you want to talk?
Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like for me, it like a lot of it comes down to who's cooking it. And like, for example, I like sort of give the benefit of the doubt to anyone of like Filipino descent in any generation to sort of play with the food however they want. I think that when it's someone who's not from the Filipino community, I definitely am a little bit more skeptical of it, because I wonder sort of what their ties are and what authority they have to be able to sort of decide that they're going to change it or improve on it or anything like that. And I think we should sort of always be conscious of sort of who is the audience for certain things. Not that that makes anything worse or better than another thing, but I think that, I think it is something to sort of just like question, like, who are people creating restaurants for and like presenting dishes in a certain way for? And I think that's just something to like think about. I don't think it's necessarily something to, I'm not going to get mad about
Yeah.
the intended audience of a specific place, but I do think that is something to sort of be aware of.
Yeah, I'm gonna side with that answer too. It's like it's not a question that has an answer for me, like just personally. But again, it kind of goes back to my point of just having the resources, because like if we're talking about, so even just say Toronto, for example, I'm like so happy that there's such a vibrant like Filipino food culture here. Even like obviously like way more than when I first moved here, like more than 10 years ago. And part of what makes that culture so vibrant is because there's such an active group of people online, particularly, I'm sure offline too, but like they're vocal online with sharing resources, so sharing whatever essays, like Instagram posts with like um, information about a certain like ingredient, or it's like a whole ecosystem. So like the most, I guess my answer to that would just be like you have to like learn as much as you can and just be open to the fact that you're going to learn like yeah and it'll eventually become a part of the Canadian or American like context.
Yeah, I think we have just time for one last quick question. We're 2 minutes shy of 9. Any takers?
I really like Sarah Lynn's questions in the chat though. We can
Yeah, why
vocalize
don't we
that if
go
you
through
would
that?
like sharing that. Hi. Did you want to
Yeah,
share the
let's do
questions
that.
or?
Yeah, sure. You can go ahead, Nastasha.
Okay, so Sarah Lynn's question was in relation to the last question, who meaning who was it for, and the who was a big part of the why and the intent. So yeah, I guess like that was in relation to Bettina's like comment.
All right,
I
I
don't know
think
if I answered the question.
yeah. Actually, I think this is a good place to wrap up. But I guess before we end, I'm super happy to share that we raised $200 from the ticket sales, and all this money will go towards Mad Travel's projects. And I don't know, maybe Raf, you can, if you want to say like a few words. Actually, Raf, the founder of Mad Travels, here with us. Yeah.
Thanks, Rafi. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Raf from the Philippines. I actually prepared a short video, but it's still rendering, so I'll send you guys the link so you can see a little more. But I'm very grateful to Nastasha and to Raf Ignacio for looping me in here. We've been working with indigenous communities in the Philippines for the past 5, 6 years, initially through tourism and through Mad Travel. Mad means make a difference. So, uh, and tourism's been kind of tough lately. So we've shifted significantly into food. And just so you know, the money that you guys raised will actually go to the Feed Farmers Today, Fund Tomorrow's Forest program, which is basically our like innovative take on moving from charity towards sustainability. So these people, they earn something like 2,000 pesos a month. So that's almost nothing, right? And they're bound to get donations. So we said rather than donate to them, why don't we hire them to plant fruit and forest trees? So it's paid work, dignified work, right? Because we don't want to teach them how to beg again. And in the last 11 months, they've planted 10,600 trees, half of which are cashew trees. And so we're already beginning And so we decided that, hey, we should really support their cashew business because they can produce, right? So Nastasha, when you were there were actually a lot of cashew trees already. So we started
Oh,
harvesting.
really?
And it's interesting because the volcanic ash that envelops the whole province is actually perfect for the growth of cashew trees. So yeah, thank
Interesting.
you. And I'll send you guys a link with a little more information and video and pictures of it. Yeah, thanks guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Raf. All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. This is just the first of many more events this year. And if you had a good time, please tell your friends about it. And you'll receive like a short feedback form via email. And if you have any like suggestions, comments, would really love to know because we want to make sure that these events improve over time. So thanks again, everybody. And yeah, I'll see you in the next
Thanks for
event.
joining, everyone.
Have a good night.
Thank you.